Hey there. So we're picking up on policy design. This is part two of a three-parter. So let's get straight into it. We left off last time talking about goal conflicts and trade-offs when it comes to public policies. And so let's dig into these trade-offs a bit. So equality. This is a contested goal. We discussed equality in the very beginning of this course when we were bringing up the seven regime values. Remember, individualism, equality, community, distrust in government, and the rest, right? In the United States, we don't guarantee equal outcomes, but the general principle behind our approach is equality of opportunity. And so we have equal opportunity while not guaranteeing equal outcomes. And this equal opportunity is dominant in our discourse, right? Everybody gets a chance um, to make it for themselves in the United States, right? That's kind of a global understanding of what the U.S. is and what it has always been. Everybody starts with the same rules and same chances. Um, Policy focuses on removing barriers to entry, right, and allowing for minimal intervention in the markets, right. So we do have some things that help us kind of gain that through a public policy, public education, right, anti-discrimination laws. This equality of opportunity certainly is not perfect, right? If you look around your, um, uh, uh, various media sources or just kind of your understanding of what it is to be an American, this is a goal, right? This is not a um, guarantee. Although um, I think it's a predominant understanding that this is what the American dream is. Equality of outcome, right? Other social democracies, that's their goal. Um, right? Again, we have equality of opportunity. Other social democracies, other democracies have equality of outcome. And this focuses on the end distribution of resources. Policy kind of tries to narrow the gaps between different groups, a lot of market intervention, progressive taxation, universal benefits. Um, and so there's this kind of balancing individual liberty with the collective welfare and efficiency with equity when it comes to this kind of guaranteeing equality of outcome. And so I just wanted to juxtapose those two things here. In the US context, we have this notion of um, equal opportunity. In social democracies around the world, um, there are different emphases on equality at the back end for equal outcome. Efficiency. This is kind of a tested goal too. And efficiency means achieving the most output for the least input, right? The biggest bang for the buck, as it were, right? Um, this is usually a means to a goal, not an end in itself. What we're trying to do is achieve an objective with the least amount of resource. So the least cost, the least number of hours, the time, personnel, whatever it may be, um, that leads to efficiency. This kind of comes into conflict with others like comprehensiveness, equity, effectiveness. But this is kind of a core concept, a core goal. And if you look at what's been done at the federal level recently, this is the goal that was promoted. This is, the Doge experience of Elon Musk and his cabal there in Washington as they're coming in to reform government. This is kind of their emphasized goal, right? And that comes with a trade-off with other goals that we have. The key considerations around efficiency are: how do we define it and how do we measure it? How do we define and measure the outputs and the inputs and the outcomes? Who is it efficient for, right? Is it efficient for government, for the citizens, for specific groups? Where is the focus on this efficiency? Are we thinking long term, short term? We often think that efficiency is neutral. Um, but it again, like many other things, especially when it comes to a public sector policy, it depends on how we value differently the inputs and outputs into the system. It's difficult to measure. Defining inputs and outputs, what counts as input? Money times staff, what are the outputs? Test scores, patient health, miles of road laid. Um, Data accuracy is a problem. thinking about short-term gains versus long-term results? What are we giving up to pursue efficiency? What is the opportunity cost? I think again, those folks with the Doge reform in DC have come up against some of these measurement challenges. If you looked at how they've calculated their savings for the reforms that they've implemented, the numbers are widely different depending on the time frame you're thinking about or the day that they're being considered, whatever it may be. We're looking at kind of the the business mindset coming into Washington to focus on efficiency. In a business, this works because efficiency is measured by profit, right? That's an easy bottom line. But in government, we don't make profits. We don't focus on profits. And so leading to this kind of efficiency only approach gives us a great deal of difficulty when it comes to, hey, what have we done? What have we done here? What have we saved? What efficiency measures are the most accurate to tell us whether these efforts are worth it or not? So here's some policy examples when it comes to efficiency to think about how we would calculate these things. So education, cost per student versus learning outcomes or graduation rates. Healthcare, speed of the treatment versus improvements in patient health. Welfare, the administrative cost versus the value and reach of the benefits delivered. And infrastructure, quick, low-cost repairs, durable long-term solutions. I like this last one because you could think about it just like your everyday experience. Asphalt is cheap, it's easy to lay down, and it's meant to last about 10 years, right? Concrete, it's difficult to mix, difficult to lay down because it hardens quickly, difficult to level out, but it lasts 4 times as long sometimes, depending on the mixture. I went to school with some civil engineers and we talked about this one day, and the general focus is it's quick and easy to lay asphalt. And so that efficiency cost of having to replace it every 10 years outweighs that approach of something that you lay down that it costs a bit more in terms of time and effort and man hours to put down the concrete. But the concrete's going to last longer. And so you have to balance out those kind of two with this approach. So quick, low cost, durable, long term. Here's a perspective from political scientist Herbert Simon. A good public library is not one that owns all the books that have ever been published, but one that has used limited funds to build up as good a collection as possible under the circumstances. So efficiency from this perspective is making the best possible use of our limited resources, not maximizing every possible outcome. There's some political dimensions of efficiency as well. And what this often results in is the notion that if you can say that something is wasteful, that is the best political argument you can make against a public policy. It may be working great, it may be saving lives, it may be solving problems, it may be one of the best policies ever created. But if you can say that this policy is wasteful, it's like a leaky bucket dripping money, then you can kind of expose that policy and get it reversed, overridden, or find a lack of support, or just challenge that policy. That kind of notion that it is inefficient, it is wasteful, right, is the easiest thing to target when it comes to trying to identify a policy that you don't like, whether it works or not. So let's move into the equity. This is also a contested goal. And so we think about um, uh, equity and equality in kind of similar circumstances. While equality means sameness, equity is fairness. Fairness in the distribution of resources, opportunities, and outcomes. This is a central goal, but it's also highly debated because there's the question about what is fair. And then at the same time, there is a notion that equity is often comes at the expense of efficiency and then freedom or liberty. And then equity also reintroduces this notion of, do we focus on equal processes or equal outcomes? Equity often is concerned with kind of the equal outcomes. Um, and then there's the debate about, okay, where does government step in? What inequities does government need to solve? Where should it intervene? There's a few different types and dimensions of equity. Horizontal equity is we would treat similar cases similarly. Equal tax rates for people with equal incomes. Vertical equity is treating different cases differently to account for differences. So, like a progressive tax system. There's intergenerational equity, fairness between current and future generations. And then there's procedural versus substantive equity, fairness in the process versus fairness in the results. And I think, if you look back on some recent equity decisions from the Supreme Court or in policy statements, you can kind of recognize where some of the back and forth is around these particular issues, around the kind of concept, the policy dimension, and the policy trade-off area of equity. There's different ways to advance equity: universal programs, things that are provided for all; targeted interventions, those that are built and designed for disadvantaged groups; redistributive policies, trying to shift resources; and safeguards, like fair treatment, due process, through things like anti-discrimination laws. So we have to choose among these based on context, values, political feasibility. It seems like recently the Supreme Court has challenged this kind of targeted intervention notion of equity and is kind of leaning much more toward this kind of universal equity approach. At least that's how I read it. I don't know. I'm not a court person. The next one we have here is security versus liberty. And this is a classic one, right? How much liberty do you give up to be secure? And if you kind of go back in our minds to our discussion around political theory and liberalism and Enlightenment thinkers, we can talk about a couple of them here who had kind of different notions of resolving this kind of conflicting goal area. Thomas Hobbes, it says we should give up this kind of a lot of our liberties to a powerful sovereign. He called it Leviathan in his book, in exchange for security and order. The state has a lot of authority to prevent chaos, and security is seen as a foundation for everything else. We think that in Hobbes's view, people are self-interested, prone to conflict, and because of that, we need a strong central source of power and control. John Locke, on the other hand, had a different perspective on this. And he says that, okay, let's enter into a social contract. Let's give up some of our liberties and form a government that has some restricted powers, right? So we're not going to give up a lot of our liberty, but we're going to give up some to make sure that we are secure. And the primary role of the government is to ensure life, liberty, and property. And so these are kind of inherent or natural rights coming from natural law, right? This kind of right to life, right to liberty, right to property. And the government exists based on the consent of the governed. We kind of go back and forth, right? You've seen some perspectives recently of this kind of strong, dominant, central approach where security is the number one priority. And then a lot of pushback on that from this kind of notion of Locke's perspective of, no, we have this ordered system where we are defining the powers and the limits of government. We're keeping rights, and we're going to only give up so many so that we can be secure in our persons, but also retain liberty and freedom to do whatever we'd like, right? And so for the most part, Thomas Hobbes lost the debate when it came to the founding of the United States, right? But if we think about the changes in our perspective on liberalism and our changes of a kind of philosophical foundations here, this debate is still very valid. So we can think about this in a few different areas, right? National security, public health, gun control, internet regulation. The best thing here is that a good policy is going to find a balance between these two, right? A balance between what you have to give up to what you can keep, right? How do you limit liberty for security, but recognize that these things are often at odds and strike a balance between them. So let's kind of we talked about these goals and this conflict, and let's think about um, how sometimes ambiguity steps in here, and stakeholders may value different goals and interpret them in various ways. This stems directly from our seven values discussion, right from the beginning of the term. Right, we all have different perspectives on what individualism is, what equity is, what community is, what our distrust of government, and where the sources for that come from, right? So all of these different ideas around how we interpret those seven values individually, how they're interpreted by our institutions, um, how we define problems based on that interpretation. These things all lead to goal conflicts and ambiguity when it comes to understanding um, public policies and the public policy design. Um, we value different goals differently. And so those disagreements can lead to those different values can lead to disagreements about the goals of the problem and how we get to the solution for it, right? So the goals and the means or the methods, right? So a quick example you could just kind of imagine in your mind, you have immigration policy and then our foreign relationship with Mexico, for instance, right? Our foreign relations goals versus our immigration policy. These two things can sometimes be at odds and lead to conflict. Doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means the policy is complex. That's why it's really fun, right? So we have to think about the intersections and the interconnectedness among different policy areas, right? And among our different trade-offs and the different goals that we have. And so again, effective policy isn't going to come up with the perfect solution, right? I think there's no way to really ever have a good policy because everybody's going to, one, define it differently, and two, there's going to be trade-offs no matter what. But again, something that finds balance, something that is workable. That is the best approach to take for public policy. Ambiguity can be useful. You're bringing in broad coalitions that views the policy means or the policy ends from broad perspectives. And this kind of leads to kind of discussion around those trade-offs. And maybe that can help us understand how to take iterative steps towards improved or better policy. So here's some examples for these kind of conflicts. Environmental policy, classic one is protection versus economic growth. Carbon reduction versus energy affordability, conservation versus resource development, local impacts, global benefits, right? These are kind of real world trade-offs around environmental policy, things that from different ideological perspectives for the same policy domain area, different policy communities are going to interpret what the goal is in a different way, right? So if, say, we are looking at environmental area versus or environmental area where there is the chance to develop a large portion of land that has valuable resources on the ground or below the surface, right? And so some people are going to come into this, the policy community is going to exist of people in a particular domain for this area who want to not drill for oil or not mine for minerals, for instance, or not log for lumber. And they're going to, have this kind of environmental protection perspective. At the same time, in the same place, you're going to have folks who say, "Hey, we need jobs in this area, right? We need to develop these resources. They are there, they're available, and this can provide an economic boon for the community, for the economy, it can put people to work in an area that is doesn't have a lot of opportunity, right? So you have to kind of balance these, right? And so maybe a good policy for that perspective will be a trade-off between those who want to total protection versus total, use, um, to have some sort of built-in goals that reflect the interests of both sides around this. Healthcare policy, here's some kind of trade-offs too. Universal access versus cost containment, quality of care versus efficiency, patient choice, standardized treatment, prevention, treatment funding. Effective policies are going to try to manage these conflicts transparently, make them clear and understandable, how both sides or both kind of perspectives approach a particular policy debate. If the conflict's not going to go away, but through transparency and compromise, a better policy may occur. So again, these kind of common trade-offs: efficiency versus equity. So cost effectiveness versus fair distribution, security versus liberty, protection versus freedom, speed versus deliberation, quick action, careful planning, standardization, flexibility. So trying to balance these competing goals, we can think about prioritization, compromise, sequencing, compensation, or some sort of mixed strategy. The tensions aren't going to go away, right? Through transparency and information and alignment of goals around the kind of final outcome can often lead to balance when it comes to developing good public policies. So, competing goals in healthcare policy: universal access, quality, cost, autonomy, patient choice. That's a lot to reconcile. Balancing approaches: a tiered system. So, universal coverage with additional plans, quality metrics, performance based payments for to incentivize high standards, coordinated care and oversight, and some sort of mixture of public versus private. We can often think about how complexity seeps into these policy decisions. Um, One way here is looking at this example, and ask ourselves: are we trying to eliminate a problem, hold it steady, or reduce it to a lower level? Right, and we can use the example of war on drugs, right? So eliminate, zero tolerance, maximum enforcement, severe penalties. This went on for a really, really long time, um, and led to some um, results. Right, let's just say that. Holding steady is kind of where the most recent approach to um, this kind of war on drugs has been. Right, targeted enforcement, education campaigns. In other countries and social democracies around the globe, and here beginning in the United States recently, harm reduction strategies have kind of taken center stage. Center stage in other countries. Here, they're still on the side, but they're being embraced more and more in different ways, right? So the kind of question is: hard, fast elimination, hold steady, or reduce to a low level. Different tools, different resources, different timeframes, different metrics for success are going to be in place for each different type of approach that we take here. So let's move into this idea of scalability. If we're thinking about our policy goal, and we're thinking about building a policy that works at scale, how much change do we need? What's feasible politically? What can we actually do administratively? What resources do we have? And how long is our time frame? Right? Each of these components is going to determine the scale at which we can operate. Right? Unlimited budgets, unlimited people, unlimited time, we can do a lot. Right? Tight budgets, few people, time constraints, you can just have a very narrow, specific, targeted policy impact that is actually really good. But you have to think about this in terms of scale, right? It's going to be a smaller scale. So you could think about this through looking at climate change. Um, from an ambitious target, for ambitious scale, right? Uh, Carbon neutral by 2030. You could think moderate, 50% reduction by 35, and minimal, stabilize emissions, keep it steady by 2040. Each one is going to demand different tools. And we have to think about what our ambition, what the feasibility is when setting these targets, right? When setting our goals for the policy, we have to think, okay, what can we actually do given the scale that we have to operate at? So, core elements of policy design as we build our framework: goals, causal theory, tools, and implementation. The last two here we'll talk about in upcoming presentations. Cross-cutting themes around the discussion we've had so far on policy design. One, equity. Who benefits? Who bears the costs? Efficiency. Efficient use, or what's the best possible use of our resources. Politically feasible policies. Administrative capacity. And so if we think about how we design our policies, kind of these kind of ideas all have to come into play along with these kind of core elements that we have. Next, we're going to look at policy tools, different types of tools, how to select appropriate tools, right? So once we've designed this policy, what type of tool do we use to implement? See you then.